Good morning, everyone. This is Norm Praet with Brownlee and Whitlow and Praet. So I want to thank you all for coming to and taking part in today's presentation through Multifamily Investor Nation on mini hands, tips for working with your team towards a seamless and cost-efficient closing. Sorry, we took a couple minutes allowing people to get on initially, but we're ready to move forward now. Start by introducing myself, and then we're going to talk a bit about how to work with your closing teams, the various third parties you all work with towards a successful closing, in particular a law firm, because that's what we are, but we have a view into how things work with many of the other professionals you'll engage as well, and we'll bring up working with them throughout. Starting out, who we are, we're a provider of legal services for investment real estate, particularly multifamily communities, operating in the South and Southeast. We work with owners, investors, and managers of commercial real estate. We assist with buying, selling, refinancing properties, including enforceability opinions. If the investors have out-of-state counsel already and need in-state counsel to assist. Also, we represent many property management companies in helping them stay compliant in lease review and resolution of tenant and vendor disputes throughout the Carolinas and Georgia. We're also engaged by the National Apartment Association and review the National Apartment Association leases for both North and South Carolina. And we're currently working on a legal handbook for North Carolina for the National Apartment Association. I am Norm Praet. I'm a managing partner at the firm. I'm also general counsel to the North Carolina State Apartment Association and work with many different investor groups, primarily on multifamily communities, but on all sorts of other commercial assets. Get into the presentation now. We're going to start at the beginning and sort of work our way through a transaction process, and starting with prior to the offer, what can you do to set yourself up for success? First thing is to determine who will be on your team prior to you getting under contract or even getting an LOI. The earlier you do this, the smoother things will go for you. And your team should include legal, closing, and/or syndication attorneys. Sometimes that'll be the same firm, sometimes that'll be, and often will be separate firms. Financial, your CPA and tax professionals, you want them to be familiar with commercial real estate, and if it will be syndication, familiar with syndication as well. There are various nuances that come up, and just because they're a CPA or tax professional doesn't mean they have experience in these areas. And with that same, should go without saying, the same for your attorneys as well. Ideally, it would be good to be familiar with lenders, even if you don't know the exact lender you'll work with, to have a handful that has an appetite for the particular type of asset you're looking at and loan amount. Some of the lower loan amounts, if you're purchasing a multifamily community, could be through a community bank. You get to higher amounts, you start working 10 million, 15 million, 20, 25 million, and above. The closings look a little bit different, and you'll probably be working with some sort of national company like a Greystone, a Walker and Dunlap, Sable, Lumina, those types of companies. But knowing what lenders you'll be going to, because that whole process is probably the most timely and needs to be done as early in the process as possible. So getting your lenders sort of out of the way and straightened out. And then property and loan brokers that you'll be working with. You might not feel comfortable picking a lender yourself, but there are a lot of loan brokers out there that you can work with who will assist you and know what the type of product you're looking to invest in, what lenders have an appetite for that. And also property management professionals. You'll have due diligence done on site. Usually you'll have your property managers there as well to walk the properties and start reviewing the leases, financials, and things, assisting with that. Often they'll have engineering people who can help you walking the units as well. And then finally, a title company. They can be chosen by your attorney if you need. Usually any attorney working in this area should be familiar with several different title companies to work with, but you'll need to get them in place because As soon as you sign the contract, you'll need to be putting earnest money down, and the title company will also likely be the escrow agent. And you also need them to get started on title immediately. Timelines can vary in due diligence, but often you need to have the title done within the first few weeks of your due diligence, if not the first week. If you're geographically focused, you can also have a surveyor lined up, and having a good relationship in the current climate with a surveyor can save a whole lot of time. There's so many transactions going on now in all different types of commercial properties that surveyors can be very backlogged, we're finding lately. That's one of the first things we do when we start working on a contract as counsel, if our clients don't already have a surveyor, is to reach out and try and get a surveyor working and retained, so we know that they're going to be able to get the survey done before the closing. It's almost a pipe dream, unfortunately, to have the full survey done before the examination period expires. There's a whole lot of push from the sellers usually to have the examination period to be done in 30 days or so, and the surveyors in many instances just aren't getting it done. Sometimes we can get a carve out for survey to go beyond the examination period. Sometimes you can't. That's kind of beyond the scope of this presentation though. Also, if you're very geographically focused in environmental testing company, even though the communities are usually existing assets that are there, there still could be environmental contamination that's occurred since they were built, or sometimes you have radon issues and you have to, which occur after building and things like that, and can occur a year or two after, and they need to be addressed. So it's good to have an environmental testing company. Also, they can be delayed just like the surveyors. Also, prior to offer, if you have a group that you're working together with, a sponsor / buyer group, it's good to pick a sort of a point person to contact your professionals. One point of contact will allow you to move more quickly, and they'll also keep costs down. We work with all different groups. Sometimes we have several members that are all sort of in charge of various aspects, or maybe it's not clearly defined who's in charge of what, and we end up answering the same questions 5 times over, or speaking to several different people because everybody wants to be involved and in charge, and that just, it slows things down and it increased the costs. So having a point person to work on it with your professionals makes a big difference, both in speed and cost. And then if you're going to be doing a 1031 exchange in the purchase, you're bringing in tenant in common investors, and you might need to be forming additional entities. You'll have to have a TIC agreement, so identifying the parties that'll be involved with that is helpful. Time of drafting your letter of intent. Just check in, see if no questions yet, so that's good. I should have said initially also, I'm happy to take questions throughout, so if anybody wants to put them in the chat box, happy to address them. So back to the presentation. At the time of drafting of the letter of intent, you'll want to have your attorney review whatever form for letter of intent you're using prior to use. Make sure you're not limiting yourself or giving up some sort of opportunities or rights you might be able to get under the contract. The granted letter of intent only has a handful of points in it, and is usually 1 to 2 pages, and your contracts have probably 30 pages of points in them, but people will go back and say if something doesn't match up with the letter of intent or sort of contradicts what's in the letter of intent, opposing parties, or not opposing, but the people on the other side of the table will point it out that we didn't agree to this. It says this in your letter of intent, so making sure that you're not limiting yourself is important. Also, it's helpful to include your due diligence items in the letter of intent, and in which case you want your lender, if you're certain who they are, or loan broker, to review to make sure that you're requiring the seller provide you with all the financials that you're going to need and records you're going to need for the property to be underwritten by your lender. You don't want to have delay because you're having trouble getting items from the seller, and you're arguing as the due diligence period's going on, because you need to get everything to your lender as quickly as possible for the underwriting process. Also, it helps the loan broker to review your LOI for the timelines that are in there to make sure that they see a lot of loans closing, and to make sure that your lenders will, or the lenders they expect you to use, will be able to close in those timelines, or that you've got the ability to extend timelines if the lenders aren't quite ready. Upon receipt of the contract, should go to your legal team. At that point, with the LOI, having both is helpful. We regularly ask client, we get the contract and we ask if there's an LOI. And again, often it seems as if whoever's prepared the contract has never seen the LOI, because the terms may be very different. So it's good to know what our clients have agreed to initially, and to review or prepare the contract based on that. It'll usually be more cost effective if your attorney drafts the purchase and sale agreement. That's not always the case, but generally works that way, because your attorney, if they're preparing it, are familiar with it and will have less to tinker with, and it'll certainly take a whole lot of time to review. The opposite party certainly may have changes, but usually the party changing their own contract, it doesn't take nearly as much time and keeps the cost down as well. Also, we find that closings with clients, many or most of our clients are investor, syndicator, sponsor groups who regularly purchase properties. After the first one or two, things get more cost efficient on how we work with each other. Everybody understands what the other is looking for more. Also, we've worked out the documents, so there's less back and forth with our clients in terms of less drafts and time going on there if we get to an agreed sort of template for that specific client. And that works through, and that holds true throughout the closing process. Also, something upon receipt of the contract, make sure you include documents you need signed at closing in the PSA to ensure the seller understands the closing expectations, just like you want them to understand your due diligence items when you're working on the LOI, so there's not an issue later on those. Also, having all the items you might need in your at closing, the deed, obviously, lien waivers, bills of sale, assignment of leases and contracts, proration agreements with respect to what happens to rents received afterwards, tenant notice letter, vendor notice letters, sometimes HOA estoppel agreements. The earlier you can get everybody on the same page on those, the better. Moving on to when you're under contract, make sure to communicate your targeted closing date range to your team as soon as possible. The PSA date may or may not be the actual closing date. If any of your team members that get the PSA will assume initially that the PSA closing date is the actual closing date, but sometimes clients have a built-in extension period and they know very early on they're going to be using that. Sometimes they have the intention of closing earlier than that by a week or two, because they've got a lender who is just on top of everything and can get this all done. If it's going to be earlier, or you're going to be cutting down the time frame at all, certainly all of your team members are going to need to know that to make sure that we can make that happen for you. It also affects escrow setup. Initially, once you're under contract, the steps are getting escrow set up with the title company and ordering the title commitment at that time, survey ordering. Again, usually a long lead time and a high cost service. So getting, if there's time to reach out to a few different surveyors to make sure the ones that you're using are cost effective. Also, usually you want to reach out to the surveyor who has performed the existing survey on the property if they're still around. Theoretically, it's more cost effective for them to update, not always. And also it should be easier and less time consuming for them, getting it done more quickly for you. Zoning reports often need to be ordered as a requirement from the lender. Environmental reports will need to be ordered. And also, as soon as possible, send an organizational chart for the entities and structure and identifying the managers of each entity. the earlier again that gets done, the more quickly that'll assist you. That's moving further into that, the corporate documents, make sure your CPA and attorneys have time to review and coordinate where the entities will be formed. The borrower may be required to be in Delaware, depending on your lender. That's anything above 15 million or so. Often the borrower will have to be in Delaware, and sometimes below that, that's common throughout the country. You want to coordinate who will form the entities. You as the purchaser, the closing attorney, or the syndication counsel if they're different. Who will prepare the company agreements? Again, that's usually the closing attorney and or the syndication counsel. Just making sure who's doing the initial stabs at all of these, so there's not confusion later on, or certainly not any redundancy of efforts or unnecessary costs. Then after it's been formed, often the syndication counsel will form the company agreement for the borrower, because that's going to go into your PPM if you're syndicating. But then you'll get a series of lender requirements also, usually requiring that the borrower be a single purpose entity. And many of these requirements, they're very similar, but the wording changes lender to lender. They'll have various definitions from your loan documents that'll need to be put into your operating or company agreements. They'll have the single purpose entity provisions. They may or may not have requirements for things such as springing members. If all the members cease, somebody else to be members, then automatically somebody, either a third party or possibly one of the individual humans that are involved on the sponsor side might be a springing member. Also on the loans 15, 20 million above, they'll require that independent directors or managers be appointed. The loan documents will specify you can't do X, Y, and Z in lower loans, in higher cost loans and higher dollar value loans. They'll specify you can't do X, Y, and Z. Also, the only way you could ever possibly do it is if all directors or managers vote, and they'll insert a director who will never vote for that. So there's no way that the company can legally do what the bank doesn't want it to do in terms of various actions. You also want to coordinate who will register the company in the property jurisdiction. If you're forming in Delaware, but you're purchasing a property in Atlanta, you'll have to be registered in both Delaware for the initial formation, and then the owning entity will need to be registered in Georgia as well. That's another step in the process. Who will obtain certificates of good standing. Generally, those all need to be prepared or obtained not more than 30 days before closing, and need to be in all the jurisdictions where the borrower is formed, and often the manager of the borrower will be a separate entity. The lender may or may not have things to say about the company agreement for the manager of borrower or where they're formed, just kind of coordinating all that. Also, who will gather the company agreements for the previously formed entities. So some of our clients take a very active role in and kind of sort of project manage a lot of getting the documents together. The majority of our clients leave that to us, and just need to be clear who's getting what as you're going on. During the due diligence, you want to identify and provide third-party contracts to be assumed or entered into to your team you're working with, often your CPAs, your attorneys, and just having those contracts reviewed. So especially if it's something new that something you're assuming and you haven't worked with this vendor before, trash, the removal of the waste, the valet trash, where many communities these days have the trash picked up at the residence door by a valet trash service who will remove it. Internet's another big contract, and often that's already in place on the property when you take it over. So having all those reviewed, find out if you need to terminate, how you do that, and what are the standards of service and what's being guaranteed under these contracts. They all vary substantially and can make a difference later on. We were just working on one internet issue where contract was assumed, but there's by the company providing the service, but there's no uptime guarantees and not a whole lot that the property can do due to the spotty service if you just look to the contract itself. Also, the financials and the due diligence often want to be your property manager and your CPA as well. If you're not very skilled in financial interpretation, also it's good to have another set of eyes on things like that. And the form of leases should be reviewed by your property manager and ideally your attorney as well, especially if it's not a national lease that's being used or one that's very prominent to be used around the country. Some property management companies have their own, and owners have their own leases, and those can vary dramatically in how effective they are. Moving on. Lender and attorney. Talked about the importance of getting the lender involved as early as possible and deciding who that lender will be, because the lender will inform your survey requirements. Some surveyors won't start until they have the lender requirements because it might drastically affect what they're charting and what they're putting on the surveys for the property. So that can really slow things down, not having those lender requirements. If you worked with a lender on a similar product before, then you possibly can use prior survey requirements and have the surveyor get started. But especially if it's a new lender or a new type of loan product where the requirements might be different for the survey, you want to get that as soon as possible. Lenders have various requirements regarding your organizational structure. We talked a little bit about many lenders will insist that the organization be formed in Delaware, but they also might have, sometimes there's the borrower, and before you get to the real promoter and others, there needs to be another sort of intermediate entity that owns the entire interest in the borrower, depending on the type of loan it is and things like that. Just depending on the loan structure that's put forth by the lender. Also, they'll tell us what outside counsel opinions are required. Non-collusion / non-consolidation, anything over 20 million. This is a very specific opinion that often the lenders will only give you a list of a handful of outside counsel that they'll accept. There's a handful of law firms in the country that specialize just in giving these opinions. Then enforceability opinions. You'll pretty much always be required to have an enforceability / attorney opinion by the state where the property is. If you were required to form in Delaware, often you'll be required to have an enforceability opinion required with respect to the entity in Delaware. Also, if you have other different aspects of your entity or entities, maybe you and your two business partners each have your own entities that are going to be the managers of the manager of the borrower. Some lenders may want opinions based on where you formed your entities, whether they're in the state where you're from or in a sort of hotbed state performing entities like Wyoming or Nevada or something like that. So you might need to retain local counsel where you formed your initial entities. Also, the lender may require that the loan documents be viewed under New York law, and anything litigated other than possibly a foreclosure, which would have to be done where the property is, be done in the state of New York and will require a New York opinion as well. So sometimes the lenders will have people that they can recommend that we go to that work with these lenders all the time and will give a very cost-effective state of the loan documents or state of the lender opinion. Sometimes we need to just go out and find those ourselves. But the earlier we become aware of the requirements, the earlier we can get people on board to start fulfilling them. Check, just doing a brief check. Nothing in the chat box yet. Moving on, lender and attorney continued. Corporate certificates and resolutions. Hold on, we just had a question up here. Why do lenders like New York laws, and is that changing? Was a question that popped up from, I believe, Jaspreet. I believe a lot of them are based out of New York State. A large financial organizations are there, and they're familiar and comfortable with they're located out of there, and their attorneys are out of there, so they like to organize in New York. Also, New York has a lot of experience litigating commercial claims, so that may be a reason as well. Haven't really seen that changing at all at this point. We have seen we do see lenders all over the country, but more of them require the loans to be interpreted based on New York law than any other state or jurisdiction we see. Moving on, lender and attorney continued. Corporate certificates and resolutions. Usually best to have these draft. These will be in lender requirements that they'll have the entities certifying that these are their articles of organization. This is their company agreement. There are no other agreements in effect. It's in the resolutions where the borrower and the managers of the borrower all say it's in the company's best interest, and everybody's signing off on purchasing the property and accepting the loan from the lender. Generally, these are very specific documents. Occasionally, lenders have forms, but usually that'll have to be prepared. And it's best if your attorneys do it, unless you're very, very familiar with the process and have seen these documents many, many times. It'll just be quicker and more cost effective. If you as the client are obtaining certificates of formation or good standing or authority, and you're very familiar and comfortable doing that is making sure it's within the 30 days prior to close, but as far out as possible, and getting those to your attorneys so they can make sure the lenders approve whatever has been received. Some of the documents get confusing. Also, making sure that the attorneys have time to review and incorporate those into your corporate certificate and resolutions. With respect to your title requirements, the lender will have quite a few. Your attorneys can provide owner endorsements that the lenders won't have anything to say about, but if you're familiar and comfortable with title commitments and you have specific endorsements that you want on behalf of the borrower as well, let your attorneys know. Also, let everybody know if there's any outstanding work to be done to the property during and post closing. The lender will take a very close interest in this because they want to make sure that the asset supports the loan that they're giving, and if any work is being done, they want to make sure it's being done in a professional manner, up to code and all those things. And they'll have various reserve-based agreements. You'll also probably want to have an escrow agreement that if you're having to put all sorts of money in reserves and the seller has agreed to pay for it, you don't want to have to put it in reserves and then pay it out to get the funds from the seller. You want to coordinate that so you're not paying multiple times or anything like that, and just waiting for a year to get your money back. So working all that out with your attorneys and the lender and the seller as early as possible. Loan documents. There are certain highlights that should be reviewed as you're reviewing with both your attorney, your CPA, and even your property managers. With specifically reporting requirements should be reviewed together with your property manager to make sure they will be achievable, and your property managers will are required to give you all the information you need and or the reports that you'll need to give your lender. We can't have the property managers getting you figures on the 20th of the month when you're required to report them to your lender on the 15th of the month. So making sure that everybody's on the same page there, and it may require going back once you receive the lender requirements and reviewing your property management agreement and making sure that the property manager is going to give you everything in a timely manner. When reviewing the loan documents and trying to negotiate them, some lenders are more amenable to negotiation of loan documents than others. The most stringent are usually the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac documents. And federal government documents, there's usually a very narrow window of what can be negotiated there, but that'll vary lender by lender. It's important to have knowledgeable counsel assist in the document review. There's other things that you wouldn't expect to pop up in the loan agreements. Limitation on disbursements during the entire life of the loan. And we've seen those from time to time, which if you've got a PPM that says you're expecting to give distributions after the first quarter or the second or the third, and your loan documents say you can't make any disbursements, then there's going to be a problem. You don't want to end up in default. The repayment structure, if you pay the loan off prior to the maturity dates because you have market still good and you have great returns after 2 years, but you've got a 3-year loan. How much are you going to have to repay? What does that look like? Is it a defeasance where the lender is going to replace the loan and it's going to take additional time and significant additional costs? Will the interest on the loan be cut off the day you pay it off, or will that extend to the end of whatever the period is? Or will there be further interest you have to pay because you're paying the loan off early? Will there be any points or percentage of the loan that's due by paying it off early? And if so, does that sunset over the period, or is that through the entire loan period? Again, we touched on reporting requirements a little bit. Both can your property managers meet them, and also are they something that you're going to be comfortable doing even outside of that, such as how often are results audited? Do you have anybody that's going to audit these results? Who needs to sign off? Do you as a sponsor, need to sign off on each time a reporting is done monthly, or can you just sign off on an annual, have the property manager send the reports over and you just sign a certification annually or quarterly or something like that? Notice requirements. Can you negotiate any sort of notice requirements before being in default, and when? Single purpose entity provisions, do they work with your intended organizational structure? If you're working with a REIT or something like that, depending on, or you put together a fund of whatever sort, will that work? Or you possibly may need to put additional layers into your org charts because your borrower might not be able to be a fee, or the owner of your borrower may not be able to be a fund. You might have to have another entity in between. So that really varies on lender requirements there. Moving on, closing preparations. We provide ourselves on our service. We provide ourselves on anticipating what's going to happen, but every closing, there is a flurry of activity right before the closing in the final week or two. There'll be new requirements or new interpretations of requirements that were never released before. And there's just no way that there isn't. You can do everything you can to meet all the closing checklists, and there's still going to be a flurry right before closing in our experience. So make sure your team is ready. Make sure everybody is reviewing the closing checklist. Identify a notary, UPS, FedEx, door box, and near you. Most of these closings are what are called mail-away closings. You're not often going to your attorney's office. Your attorney may be somewhere else in the country. You're often you'll get most of the signature documents, the loan documents, a week out or 2 weeks out even. But sometimes there'll be new documents from the lender, new documents from the title company or something that'll need wet signatures or need notarization, and they'll need to be done in the last few days. So make sure you know your drop-off times and where you can get notaries done. That'll make your life easier rather than trying to find that when you're really under pressure. Requesting signature pages early as possible. Confirm who needs to sign. It's our practice to limit the signatures as much as possible. We'll set up those resolutions and certificates we talked about earlier, trying to get all the loan documents down to one person, with the exception, and also ancillary documents such as bill of sale or assignment of leases. All that put authority in one person. The fewer signers we have, the fewer moving pieces, the fewer things that can break in the process. However, you may have several key parties that are being underwritten based on the amount of the loan or things. So You're going to have, you may have other, more than one individual that have to sign some of the documents, such as guarantees or environmental indemnifications or things like that. So just making sure you know who has to sign which documents and people aren't being left off and they're getting all the documents they need to sign. Way there, closing continued. Throughout the process, it's ideal to have a Dropbox or box of some sort in place. Often you'll have one with the lender. You might have a separate one with the seller. You might be putting some of your due diligence in a Dropbox. If you're preparing anything yourself or having anything put into a Dropbox yourself that you expect your attorneys or any of your other team members to see, you probably want to shoot them an email when you're putting those in there. Just because it's in the Dropbox doesn't mean everybody's going to know it's in the Dropbox, especially if they haven't been told. Also, not everybody has the same naming convention, so they might not be able to easily find what you've put in there. So just making sure your communication, or as per the next slide, over communication is important. In life, find out after time, over communication is your best bet. You feel like you're telling people things multiple times, but sometimes it takes several times for people to hear things or even understand what you're saying. So over communication, especially on the days before and the day of closing, making sure you're reviewing your outstanding closing checklist items from your lender and coordinate with your attorney who is obtaining what and the status of those as final items. We talked about who will obtain what before, and that's just a very, very important to make sure everybody's on the same page. And if you as the client borrower are going to be obtaining the documents, make sure you're comfortable doing it and very familiar with what you're doing. We've had closings held up because we've had clients who said they were comfortable doing it, and what comes in to the lender at the very last minute was what we were hoping for or what was expected. There's just slight differences in the documents. Also, some jurisdictions are a lot slower in getting documents than others, and some of them there's a lot more process. In Delaware, even though it's a main company for organizations, isn't as easy to get documents sometimes as some of the other states. Delaware generally has to overnight some of the documents back to you and won't email them unless you do have a 2-hour turnaround, which you pay an extra $500 for. So just the processes and working with people who are familiar with the processes is under a tight timeline, it's invaluable. Also, beginning a settlement statement in coordination, gathering invoices earlier, making sure you have all your invoices to give to usually the title company who's the escrow agent. We have a question from Vincent in the box. Once a syndication has been set up, can these docs be used on the next deal, changing LLC names and other info? Theoretically, your documents will look very similar deal to deal. That'll depend on your syndication attorney. There's usually specific information in each, rather than just a name change. You might have one of the important things in syndication documents are the risks that you're disclosing and things like that. So those may change deal to deal. Large part, they might be similar. And as I said, working with the same attorneys, you also might realize a whole lot of efficiencies working with the same ones again and again, because the attorney might make all those changes and it might be significantly less on subsequent closings because you've worked things out with them already. Also, syndication documents, you're often needing to register with the SEC as an exempt offering. So that will vary. And the Edgar, which is the computer system you use, is not intuitive at all and very wonky. So keeping an attorney involved is probably a good idea, and I would certainly recommend it. Could you use the documents and just substitute? Possibly. Also, over time, legal requirements change. Often in your PPM, you'll have a legend of all the state-specific notices and things you put in there. So those may change and should be tweaked every year based on new legislation or new requirements in the various jurisdictions. So the short answer is possibly you can use the same documents. I would still recommend having your syndication attorney involved. We have another comment that is good content. Appreciate that. Certainly happy for any kudos you want to give. Moving on to the next one here, I guess that's the presentation on working with your teams. It looks like we've got a couple more questions popping up. Can we share the slides? We're happy to share this. We're happy to share the slides through. We'll coordinate that through the Multifamily Investor Nation, and are happy to have those shared there. With specifically with respect to the due diligence, that's certainly something you want to work on over time and hone. Vincent asked if we are in New York. Not at present. We work with local attorneys in New York. We assist clients throughout the United States, and if we're not already licensed in that state, we'll affiliate with local counsel. And for various state-specific requirements as well, though. A lot of the business side and lender side requirements look the same, whether the property is being closed in Florida or North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, New York, Wyoming. There are certain nuances, though, so that you should be aware of as you're going into new jurisdictions. So having local counsel involved is important if you're not familiar with that already. I think that looks like all we have there in terms of questions. I'll give it another minute or so. But I think we've answered them all. I want to thank you all for tuning in today. My contact information is on the screen. If anybody has any specific information, easiest way is probably to email us. And just want to thank the Multifamily Investor Nation for having us and allowing us to work with them and be a part of their presentations. Thank you all for attending. Oh, forgetting somebody else popping up. It's just another thank you. So thank you all. It's been a pleasure.